Good morning, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me here today. I am Anup Bandivadekar, and I will be speaking about the emission standard and real driving emissions in Indian context. For those of you who don't know, I am with the International Council on Clean Transportation, or ICCT for short. We are a not-for-profit organization focused on reducing air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions from all modes of transportation. Today, I would start with this bigger framework on what kinds of regulatory tools and incentives are needed really to reduce air pollution from transportation. And as you can see, it's a long list of possible interventions, from new vehicle policies to cleaner fuels to in-use emission control to managing demand. In particularly today, I will only focus on a few of these, particularly the stringent tailpipe emissions standards, the clean fuels go with them, and some of the compliance and enforcement measures, particularly focusing on remote sensing as a strategy for reducing in-use emissions. So let me get going with respect to the new vehicle policies. As everybody knows, India transitioned to Bharat 6 emission standards right in the middle of a pandemic lockdown just about a year ago. And this is a major change in how tailpipe emissions from new vehicles are going to be perceived. This chart shows that for gasoline vehicles, this amounted to anywhere between 50 to 80% reductions, but a much bigger change has taken place on diesel vehicles, whether it's light duty or heavy duty diesels. PM and NOx emissions from BS6 vehicles are going to be something like 70 to 90% lower than their BS4 counterparts. And that's a major change that we are now starting to see in new diesel vehicles that are coming on road. That all of these elements shown in the box, the diesel aftertreatment systems, are essentially new at Bharat 6 levels. They include, a diesel oxidation catalyst, a particulate filter, a selective catalytic reduction SCR unit, which comes with its own urea injection system, and so on. And all of this complicated emission after control system is really enabled by is key, which is cleaner ultra low sulfur fuel. Both gasoline and diesel at 10 parts per million fuel. And there were a lot of doubts that India would actually be able to produce and supply such cleaner fuel. So look at the readiness of this ultra low sulfur fuel for January 2020, we conducted fuel quality testing in around 15 different cities, 2 gasoline stations and 2 diesel stations each. So this is BS4 level of fuel. And as you can see here, pretty much fuel quality was in compliance with BS4 levels at that time, except for one of the places, which we then ended up later retesting and found at a later date to be back in compliance. So this is with respect to gasoline in BS4 levels. And we found something similar when it came to diesels. Again, these are BS4 fuels. By and large, they were in compliance. In some cases, we already saw Delhi, for example, Mysore, Varanasi, that fuel was already 10 ppm sulfur content or better in December 2019, January 2020. So when BS6 transition happened, we went back again into these cities and tried to sample again in pretty much the same locations with some differences. And what we found was actually even more encouraging. So in the testing that we conducted between June and November of last year, we found very low gasoline sulfur content in gasoline all throughout in the cities that we tested. Unlike the previous account where at least one station had failed in our initial testing on sulfur content, every city was in compliance on gasoline side. Similarly, diesel was a similar success story that we found essentially compliance with BS6 diesel sulfur levels across the boards. And well, this is a very, very encouraging story, and detailed results will be published very soon. We also found some deviations in other fuel quality parameters that are not going to be a showstoppers in any sense, but something that we ought to watch out for. And so the key takeaway from this perspective was that India has done a phenomenal job of reducing gasoline, diesel, sulfur content, but also improving other fuel quality parameters. And for that, we should all be very proud, particularly the people here at this conference, working very hard to make sure that we have Bharat 6 fuel quality available countrywide. I know there were a lot of skeptics before this happened, whether India will make it happen and so on and so forth. But the results that we found here are exceptionally encouraging. The caveat I would add is we need to ensure that this fuel quality is excellent across all fuel parameters, not just sulfur, and is maintained as we go forward across the country. And so one thing India lacks in that particular respect is actually having a transparent and large-scale fuel quality monitoring program. And so that is one thing we would want to watch out for. There are to be concerned about as BS continue to get implemented. As I said, consistent fuel quality across the country is very important. But what I would be even more concerned about are the robust after-treatment systems put on these BS6 vehicles. As we saw, these are fairly complex systems. Drivers, cleaners, owners of these vehicles are not necessarily familiar with them. They come with a lot more electronics and onboard diagnostic systems to which they need to be familiarized with. Diesels in particular need to have high quality automotive grade urea available nationwide. And lastly, the users need to be cognizant of the nature of these systems and not tamper particularly with these kind of a complicated after-treatment system. But to see how really these systems are going to work, we have been studying it even further. But before I sort of go into that, let me just say, this is great in terms of accomplishment as India coming to Bharat 6 emission standards as of last year, which puts us pretty much on par with European Euro 6 emission standards. And I say pretty much on par because the final BS6 standard, whose second stage will go into effect in April 2023, is not really exactly the same as the final emission standards. In one particular way for light duty vehicles is lack of adoption of the World Light Duty Test Procedure. Onboard fuel consumption meters, which are now standard on all European vehicles, are not included in the Indian regulations. In fact, from real world emissions perspective, not all of the provisions of the real driving emissions that are with the Euro 6D for light duty vehicles are included fully in India. I mean, similarly for heavy duty vehicles, not all provisions of Euro 6D and E, particularly those dealing with cold start and particulate number testing during in-service conformity, have not been included. And of course, we should note that standards for three-wheelers, particularly for NOx emissions, are still quite a bit relaxed. But let's see for a moment how the new BS6 vehicles are doing. We tested in the last few months one diesel truck and one diesel bus of BS6 on the road using portable emissions monitoring system. And what we found was both encouraging on one count and did underline this point that our BS6 standards are really not on par with all the provisions of Euro 6. So on this chart, you see on the left-hand side, the NOx emissions measured for truck on the left here and bus on the right. And then on the right-hand side of this chart, you have particulate number emissions for the truck and a bus. And for each of these vehicles, we tested them according to the automotive industry standards, AIS standard requirements, and by relaxing those AIS requirements, by allowing the vehicles to drive as they normally would, rather than staying within the confines of a test itself. So good thing from this is, by and large, emissions were controlled. Particulate matter emissions, if you see particulate number emissions on the right-hand side, the bus emissions are lower than the Euro 6 requirements. On the truck, though, we found particulate number emissions exceeding in normal driving conditions. The story was quite a bit different on the NOx side. That NOx performance of the truck was exceptionally good under AIS or non-AIS. In fact, even when we applied the more stringent Euro 6E filter, where we take into account lower power threshold and lower speed windows in calculation of these emission factors, we found that the truck NOx emissions were quite low. The bus, on the other hand, was a different story. So what this underlines to us is that while these vehicles are doing quite well in practice, there are still lots of gaps that need to be filled. Let me, before moving on to the future of these standards, let me just quickly remind that we have stage 4 and stage 5 emission standards for non-road vehicles coming into effect. The stage 4, unfortunately, have been delayed by 6 months, but we hope that the stage 5 standards will go into effect as planned, because that is really when diesel particulate filters will become commonplace on all non-road vehicles. And so that deadline is April 2024, and we should hope to stick to that. So let me switch gears and look at where the world is going and what India can learn from that in terms of emission standards. So, we all know Bharat 6 is a really major step forward. We should all be very proud of that accomplishment. But we should also note that the current world-class standards are 50 to 90% more stringent than BS6. I mean, let that sink in. I mean, we are celebrating Bharat 6 emission standards for all the right reasons, but where the world's best standards are indicating that these vehicles can be even more cleaner if we push them in terms of emission standards. Let's look at it really briefly. And you can find more details of them in these ICCT publications, one on light duty and one on heavy duty side. But on light duty side, in particularly, China and US already have a more stringent emission standards, primarily because they start with the fuel neutral emission standard, and they have a tighter hydrocarbon and NOx emission limit than in China, than in India. But as we look at tier 3 emission standards that are now being phased in the US and will continue to get phased in through 2025, these standards are getting significantly tighter. I mean, how tighter? The cleanest hybrid cars that used to be what would be called super ultra low emitting vehicles in California context will be merely average vehicles by 2025 in the US. And so that is the amount of reduction that's possible, that we are currently at Euro 6 levels, and to go from Euro 6 levels to Tier 3, Bin 3 type of emissions is going to be a major change. On the heavy duty side, it's more or less the same story. The current US heavy duty tailpipe emission standards are 30 to 40% tighter than Euro 6 requirements. But California has already adopted heavy duty emission standards that are 75 to 90% lower than even those emission standards. So think about it this way, that the current limits in India or Europe are about 400 milligram per kilowatt hour for heavy duty NOx emissions. And where California aims to reach by 2027 is at 27 grams per kilowatt hour. And so the technologies to meet these heavy duty emission standards that California is talking about are already present. As you can see here, there is a host of engine technologies that are available today with little or no impact on fuel efficiency. In fact, in certain cases, these technologies can improve fuel efficiency going forward. And there are several after-treatment technologies available as well. So we see further 75 to 90% reduction in new heavy-duty NOx emissions as a very plausible target to have for the coming decade. Now, let me switch gears and talk a little bit about on-road emissions monitoring in particular. As mostly everybody knows, vehicles are and engines are measured for their emissions in laboratory under standard test conditions. And these are certification values or type approval values, as we call them. And a whole host of regulated pollutants and fuel efficiency levels are measured under these laboratory standard conditions. And of course, these conditions do not fully represent the real world. So when we want to measure emissions in the real world, when the vehicle is already on the road, we have a bunch of different testing methods available. Some of them can measure individual vehicle emissions. The others can be used to measure the entire fleets of vehicles that are passing through. In particular, common techniques these days include remote sensing and portable emissions monitoring system, the kind of results you saw for Bharat 6 vehicles were done using PEMS testing. And these techniques really vary in terms of how they are measuring these emissions. So as you can see on the left-hand side, if you measure the emissions right at the tailpipe, then those are typically the way dynamometer or PEMS types of methods would measure. Whereas if you allow the plume of emissions to come out and you measure the concentration of pollutants in that plume, techniques like remote sensing and so on make use of that particular approach. But the basic underlying calculation methods are really the same, just how pollutants are diluted before measurement differs in technique to technique. Depending upon what we are looking for, whether we are trying to understand how the fleet as a whole is operating, whether emission factor distribution of different vehicles within the fleet is something we are after, or whether we are interested in emissions of light duty diesels versus light duty gasoline, whether we are interested in going down further into saying, oh, how are 2017 diesels doing versus 2015 diesels, or how are BS6 vehicles doing compared with BS4 vehicles. Or you may want to go even more down into disaggregation and saying, oh, of the BS6 vehicles that are gasoline, how are different models of a given manufacturers performing? Or within that particular model, how are different model variants performing? And so, of course, your gold standard would be the ability to do measurements at that granular level. And depending upon what we are after, we should be picking our testing methods. So I'm just quickly going to talk about remote sensing here that some of you might be familiar with, but it's essentially a non-intrusive measurement technique that has now been around really for 30 years. But large-scale deployment of remote sensing is really a relatively recent phenomenon. But what remote sensing allows you to do is to have the vehicles pass at whatever driving conditions that are present in this road. And with the help of certain speed detectors, video cameras, and essentially kind of laser type of systems, we monitor a whole host of pollutants at one go. So, but unlike dynamometer and PEM system, which measure emissions of a vehicle over a period of time, remote sensing takes a snapshot of lots and lots of vehicles at a given particular venue and location. Now, as I said, we can use it to sample the entire fleet, or because we can use remote sensing to literally measure hundreds and thousands of vehicles over a month, let's say, we can disaggregate it by fuel type, we can disaggregate it by the emission standard, we can disaggregate it by the manufacturer of a particular vehicle type, or we can drill down to variants of a particular model. And data that we are now starting to collect using remote sensing methods in Europe, in US, is allowing us to exactly do that. So that is really the potential in the Indian context for making these changes. How can those be used to track extreme polluters? These tables show the values suggested as possible cut points for extreme polluters and high emitters by EPCA technical report. So the exact values are not so critical, but what we can have is set these cutoff points at a relatively high threshold, so that if vehicles actually fail these high enough thresholds of emissions, we know that these are certainly very high polluters, or in certain cases, extreme polluters, so that even if they fail once, we can be fairly certain that these are the vehicles that are problematic. And then we can make only these vehicles that fail remote sensing in a non-intrusive, non-obstructive, obtrusive test, to make them go for more careful, perhaps loaded mode test at a testing facility. And so this cuts down on the amount of vehicles that will actually have to undergo PUC or any other kind of testing in the future. As I said, remote sensing will have a variety of these applications, going all the way from fleet surveillance and monitoring of fleets and emission factor developments, all the way towards informing purchasing decisions. And in fact, as part of something called as a true project in Europe now, we are making available for consumers how real world emissions of different vehicles in European market are doing as part of the remote sensing measurements. So let me bring this to a close with a bunch of observations that I didn't have time to get into during the presentation. Some of these things I already observed, that India does need to get, as a first step, on board with all the provisions of Euro 6. That would include things like world light duty testing procedure, better conformity factors, and so on. But there are factors that I didn't discuss really today, like stronger refueling evaporative emission standards, and having goals and objectives for using onboard diagnostics for better evaluation of in-use emissions monitoring, and so on. And finally, given where the world is going in terms of future emission standards, India needs to start now discussion on the next phase of emission standards, the Bharat 7 emission standards, that at least should aspire to be on par with Euro 7 emission standards by 2025, 2026 timeframe. And finally, now that we have ultra-low sulfur fuels available across the country, this is going to be the time over the next several years to think about no diesel without filter strategy for reducing vehicular emissions. BS3 and before vehicles probably need to be scrapped by 2028 timeframe. And BS4 vehicles, which at that time will be nearly 10 years old, should be required to retrofit a diesel particulate filter by 2028 or retire from the fleet at that point of time. As we discussed, this is a very broad and comprehensive agenda and a really big step for emission control is still forward. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, please feel free to send them my way or visit our website of ICCT. Thank you.